Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming along to our latest webinar from Marketing Sciences Unlimited. What do consumers really think about sugar? So my name is Becki Hutchins. I'm a Senior Research Executive here at Marketing Sciences. And in our latest webinar, I'm joined by Becki Arnold, who is a Research Director, and Debbie Parker, who is our Sensory Manager. And they're both going to talk to us a little bit about sugar and some work that they've been doing in this area. If you have any questions at all, please do write them in the questions box, and we can have a look at answering those at the end. So I will now hand over to Becki and Debbie.
So hi and welcome to today's webinar on sugar. As Becki said, my name is Becki Arnold. I'm a Research Director at Marketing Sciences Unlimited. My particular speciality is product testing. I have both a personal and professional interest in the subject of sugar in our diets, having worked alongside many brands trying to reduce the amount of sugar in their products, while also trying to limit my own and my family's intake of refined sugar. I also have with me our Sensory Research Manager, Dr. Debbie Parker. Hello. Who has many years of experience in sensory research and works closely with our product testing team at Marketing Sciences, helping us to uncover why people like certain products and not others, which is extremely useful in our work to reduce sugar. As Becki said, we'll be taking questions at the end of the presentation, and if we don't have time to get through all of these today, then we'll get back to you personally after the session. So for those of you just joining us, welcome to our webinar on what consumers really think about sugar. Firstly, just to explain a little bit about our experience in this area. So we've been product testing for over 30 years, so we know how changes to products can have a huge impact on how your consumers experience them. We've been involved in reducing salt and fat from many well-known brands, and most recently the focus has been on reducing sugar while maintaining taste. We've also been keeping an eye on consumers' attitudes to sugar for a number of years. So why has the focus been all about sugar recently? Well, as you're no doubt aware, the UK government recently announced a so-called sugar tax that aims to combat the rising levels of childhood obesity. The proposed tax will come into effect in 2018 and consists of two levels of tax on sugary drinks. The first level is for drinks with more than 5 grams per 100 millilitres, with the second being for drinks with more than 8 grams per 100 millilitres. To put this into context, this could mean a price increase of around 8 pence per 330ml can of Coke. And the aim is to use the projected £520 million raised from the tax to improve sports facilities in schools. Of course, manufacturers do have a little time to reformulate to try and reduce the amount of tax they pay. The proposed tax follows increasing focus in the media on the potential dangers of a high sugar diet. You've got campaigners such as Jamie Oliver, who introduced a tax on sugary drinks in his own restaurants last year, and the group Action on Sugar, a group of specialists concerned with sugar's effects on our health. So with all of this focus in the media and government on sugar, we wanted to find out what consumers have taken from it and whether it is of genuine concern to real people. In other words, do people really care about sugar in their diets? We conducted an online survey among around 2,000 adults in the UK. This was representative of the UK adult population. We've actually been asking the same questions regularly since 2014, and a couple of these questions we've also been tracking since 2012. So to answer the question, do consumers have motivation to reduce their sugar intake? Well, yes. 43% of us are concerned we eat too much sugar, with around the same proportion saying sugar is worse for your health than fat and food and drink high in calories. These figures have significantly increased since 2014, indicating the increased media focus has indeed had an impact on people's opinions. If we look specifically at the data for those saying they're concerned they consume too much sugar, as mentioned, we can see the majority agree with the statement, and the 18 to 34-year-olds are the most concerned. However, it could of course be the case that those of us who aren't concerned because we think we have a healthy diet and don't eat too much sugar, as opposed to not actually thinking that sugar is bad for us. So we also need to look at the comparison of sugar with food and drink high in calories and the comparison of sugar with fat, which of course is traditionally what we believed we had to avoid. In both cases, we can see around 4 in 10 of us believe sugar is worse, and nearly the same proportion are unable to decide. Perhaps this is indicative of being in the middle of a paradigm shift, where opinion is moving from believing that fat is the enemy to the focus being on sugar. Interestingly, we then looked at all of these statements by age. And so you've got the 18 to 34-year-olds are the green bars there, and 35 plus are the blue bars. And we can see it's those age 18 to 34 who are most concerned they eat too much sugar, and they're also more convinced that sugar is worse for your health than fat or calories. This could be simply because they consume more sugar, but we believe it's also indicative of a trend towards a culture more focused on moderation. The growth in things like apps and wearable tech devoted to health and fitness, where you can, for example, count calories, track your activity, even see how well you sleep, indicates we're moving towards a culture of self-regulation, as long, of course, as it's relatively easy to do. And along with sport and activity, food and drink consumption is central to this. We are likely to see increasing concern about the food and drink we eat, not only with regards to sugar content, but also things like reducing salt and alcohol, fat, the amount of meat, while also increasing fruit and veg and superfood consumption. We're very much going to be about everything in moderation, and it may even become socially unacceptable to be seen constantly eating unhealthy food and drink, as we become more aware of the social implications of this in terms of things like government spend on healthcare and the environment. So we're moving towards a culture of self-regulation as people become more and more aware of how the food and drink they consume is affecting their bodies. But what are we actually prepared to do about it? Well, we know that habits in general are hard to break. In a study by UCL psychologist Philippa Lally, it was concluded that it takes roughly 66 days to cement a new habit. And we believe that eating and drinking habits are among the hardest to break, having been ingrained since childhood and of course reinforced on a daily basis. Realistically, are we going to take responsibility and change habits, or do we need a little help from the government and the big brands? Who do we feel is really responsible? We asked people if they supported government intervention in the form of the sugar tax. We first asked this in March this year before the budget and found that 41% of us supported a tax. But we then also asked 2 weeks later, so straight after the tax was announced, and found that support had increased significantly. Now, over half of us support the tax, with only 23% actively disagreeing. In both cases, support is significantly higher than in 2014, when only 30% agreed they supported the tax. We are possibly seeing the impact of the increasing media focus on sugar and the realisation that we need some help to make a real change to our diets. We then asked people after the budget whether the tax would actually make them less likely to buy sugary drinks. A third of people believe it will have an impact on their sugary drink consumption. Of course, only time will actually tell whether the tax will have an impact. If we look at the example of Mexico, where a similar tax was introduced in 2013, early indications are that consumption has reduced by around 6%. So the sugar tax has started the path towards reducing our sugar consumption and may change attitudes in the long run. But what actually is the best way of reducing our sugar intake now and quickly? Well, the majority of people believe the answer lies with the manufacturers, with 77% of us saying that brands need to do more to reduce the amount of sugar in our food and drink. And it is, of course, much easier to reduce your sugar intake if the foods and drinks that you habitually consume contain less sugar. So, in the knowledge that consumers want manufacturers to take the responsibility of reducing sugar in their brands, I'll hand over to my colleague Debbie Parker to discuss what options are open to them.
Thank you, Becky. So, from a survey in March this year, effectively 50%, that's 1 in 2 people, were actively seeking out products with less sugar. And this is a massive opportunity for lower sugar or alternatively sweetened brands. And from 2014 to 2016, this level of people actively looking for lower sugar brands has been consistent. Historically, manufacturers have used artificial sweeteners such as aspartame, sucralose and saccharin. And again, in our survey, 38% of consumers said that they avoid artificial sweeteners as they perceive them to be worse for their health than sugar. And again, this opinion has been stable since 2014. Also, when questioned, 43% claimed they would buy more diet products if they used naturally occurring sweeteners rather than artificial ones. And this was highest amongst women, that was 47%, versus men, 40%. And it was also highest amongst the 18 to 34 age group. That was 52% versus 40% for the over 35s. However, when it comes to treats, a huge 63% of consumers are quite happy with full sugar versions. And so they're not calling for a blanket reduction across everything, especially with those brands seen as treats. Of course, one solution to retain taste and not alienate consumers is to keep the recipe the same and reduce the portion size. But of course there's a limit with this, and you can only reduce portion size so much, and not to the point that consumers will then have 2 of the treats instead of 1. We know that sugar has functional effects as well. So along with the sweet taste, sugar also contributes to texture and mouthfeel properties of the products. And we need to work with manufacturers to assess the impact of reducing sugar on texture and mouthfeel properties. Also, some sweeteners are perceived as having an unpleasant flavour and aftertaste. So we were interested in investigating further the flavour of the various sweeteners in more detail. And using our trained sensory panel, we profiled 12 different fruit desserts, 6 of which contained sugar and 6 of which were no added sugar with alternative sweetening agents used. All the products were presented blind and at random so that the panel were unaware of what products they were assessing. One of the terms that the panellists described the desserts as having was an artificial sweet flavour, an aftertaste. And interestingly, what we found was that although the desserts were presented randomly, all of the variants with artificial sweeteners actually tasted more artificial sweet than their full sugar versions. It also appeared that some fruit flavours, such as blackcurrant, withstood or seemed to mask the presence of sweeteners better than some other flavours, such as orange. We were also very interested to see what actual flavours the artificial sweetness related to. And using correlation analysis, we found that artificial sweetness was associated with chemical, bitter and sour flavours, and an astringent and dry mouthfeel. So this demonstrates that replacing sugar with sweeteners does also affect mouthfeel and aftertaste characteristics. And here you can see the no added sugar versions having a more chemical flavour and a more dry mouthfeel compared to the standard sugar versions. Here you can see the no added sugar variants have a much more bitter and dry aftertaste. And we know it is the aftertaste that consumers comment about most for products containing artificial sweeteners. So we then looked at the individual sweeteners in water just to see what the differences in their actual flavours were. And these included artificial sweeteners such as sucralose and aspartame, but also a couple of examples of the naturally derived sweetener, stevia. And what we found was that the flavour and the aftertaste differed depending on the sweetener. But rather surprisingly, that the two stevia preparations that we tried were perceived as having the most artificially sweet aftertaste. Fortunately, sugar had the least artificial flavour, which wasn't surprising, but it was rather nice to see, as again all of the products were presented randomly and blind. Again, looking at this in more detail, we discovered that the artificial sweet term is related to chemical, bitter and drying flavours and mouthfeel. But also the stevia products that we tried had a distinct marshmallow, vanilla type flavour, which actually made the sugar solution seem more artificially flavoured than some of the other sweeteners. So, in summary, we found that different preparations or brands of the same sweetener can have quite different flavours. The stevia preparations that we tried gave a more artificially sweet, drying and actually a less natural flavour than some of the other artificial sweeteners. Saccharin had the least artificial sweetness, but is actually also had the strongest and longest aftertaste, and it is actually quite drying. Aspartame and xylitol gave the least drying mouthfeel and were also the least bitter and least drying linger. So perhaps the solution lies in using a combination of different sweeteners, fruit juice, honey, agave syrups, to provide a good tasting alternative to the full sugar brands.
So what can we conclude from all of this? Well, people do care about sugar, and this is a trend that we think is likely to continue. We've seen that support for the sugar tax is strong, but we don't think it's really going to change people's habits overnight. We've seen that the majority of people actually believe manufacturers are responsible for reducing the amount of sugar in our diets. But brands obviously have the difficult task of reducing sugar while retaining taste credentials, and as we've seen, mouthfeel and aftertaste as well. There is concern among consumers about the use of artificial sweeteners, but as Debbie showed, some of the natural sweeteners that are available at the moment are not necessarily the answer, as they can sometimes be as, if not more artificial tasting than the artificial ones. So we hope you've enjoyed our webinar on sugar. We now have time to answer a couple of questions that came in. We are, of course, also very willing to answer your questions following on from the webinar, so do feel free to get in touch with our friendly team at any point.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Becki and Debbie. That was really interesting. I actually have a question for myself to start us off with. So I was just wondering, do you think that the drinks industry has been particularly singled out in this sort of recent media attention around the sort of sugar tax and things? And are there any other categories, you mentioned about desserts, that you see as being particularly challenged by this?
Yeah, I think the drinks industry has really been singled out, but I think the reasoning for that is probably valid, because I think what they're trying to do is combat childhood obesity, and there are some shocking statistics about how much sugar in teenagers' diets actually just comes from soda or sugary drinks. So I think in that sense it does make sense, and it's a very good start. But I think possibly once the trend towards reducing our sugary drink consumption has started, we will see moving on to other categories. So, for example, we've quite often seen publicity about how cereals contain a lot of sugar, and I think cereals obviously is something that affects children quite a lot as well, because they often are the ones that pick the sugary cereals. I think recently we saw sugar puffs rebranding to honey monster puffs. So that's a good example of how manufacturers are responding to this already. And I think it was last week we saw Mars announce that some of their pasta sauces should only actually be eaten once a week because of the high levels of sugar. So I think as well as more obvious categories like cereals, we'll see a move towards trying to reduce the hidden sugar in products, because I don't think pasta sauces is a category that you would often associate with sugar, but it obviously is where the focus is going to go.
Okay.
Yes, and as Becki says, we've done a lot of work with known brands helping to reduce their salt and their fat, and sugar is much more on the focus now.
Okay, great. Okay, so we've got a question here as well. What do you think the next health scare will be in the food and drink industry? Do you guys have any thoughts?
Well, okay, the first one that comes to my mind is obviously alcohol. And we've seen, particularly recently, there's an increase in availability of low alcohol beers and low alcohol wines and non-alcoholic products. And this seems to be, with the increased awareness of consumers, also related to health issues, and not wanting to imbibe so much perhaps, and basically in that response the low alcohol products are much tastier than they've been before, and it gives us much more viable options, and so I think those, and again we're talking, even the wines are coming down to sort of 6 to 8.5% now, or even lower, and they're becoming much more mainstream and available, so I think that is one of the issues, or one of the new things.
Yeah. I think not necessarily a health scare, but I think we'll probably see a trend towards more natural foods. I think people don't like anymore to look at a list of ingredients in a product and think, well, I don't know what that is, I don't know what that is. I think people want to know what they're putting into their bodies. So we'll probably see less refined and processed foods and more what we call real foods.
Yeah. It's sort of like this health-conscious consumer that we're trying to do. Okay. So I think we've got time just for one more question. So there's one here that's just come in. How would you actually go about researching reducing sugar? So in the recipe.
That's a very good question. So I think we would always advocate using a combined sensory and consumer approach. So what we've found in the past is consumers are really, really good at telling us whether they like something or whether they don't like something, but quite often they're not very good at delving deeper and helping us to know why. So by doing some sensory research alongside that, we can work out what it is about certain products that makes consumers like them, and in that way then reformulate using that knowledge.
Yes, and again, and using with the sensory panel, obviously, because they're looking at all the characteristics. They're looking at not just, they don't answer whether they like it or not. They're actually looking at the texture properties, the taste, the flavour, the aftertaste, So it's all of the characteristics.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, both of you. And also thank you very much everyone for coming along and listening to this webinar. We hope that you found it useful. Just so you know, I will be sending out a recording of the webinar for you all if you want to share it with colleagues or you want to listen again at some point, that's absolutely fine. And you can also take a look on our website at some of the other webinars that we've hosted as well. So thank you very much and have a great afternoon.